Welcome to our very first episode of hashtag Cover to Cover for 2021. I hope that you had the most amazing break over Christmas and the beginning of this year. And even though we all had to be indoors and social distance, the upside is that you hopefully had more opportunity to read some of your favorite books, authors, genres, and we're going to bring you more amazing interviews, book reviews on the show this year. And in fact, speaking of which, one of the books I really enjoyed working through, and I feel a little bit bad for saying enjoy it, because it is a book that is very melancholic in some respects, is this amazing epic new novel, Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stuart. It is heart-wrenching, it's a difficult read. In fact, once or twice in public, I had to come to terms with the fact that one might cry when you are reading a book of this stature, because it really is one where the characters crawl deep inside your heart. It deals with everything from rape to addiction, abandonment, divorce, and a whole milieu of social issues that many of us, myself included, will see yourself play out in many of the scenes in this epic new novel. But it gets even better. The team at Cover to Cover has managed to secure an interview, one which I've already recorded, with this amazing author. Not only is the book incredible, it's actually a first-time novelist who wrote this fantastic book that won the Man Booker Prize. And it was an absolute joy to be able to interview the author about this achievement. And I have no doubt you're going to enjoy hearing from him as well. This is how the interview went down. Douglas, congratulations on an amazing instant masterpiece and classic. And thank you so much for joining us on Cover to Cover.
Oh, thank you for having me, Eusebius. It's my pleasure.
So the first question I have for you is, the book fundamentally for me is quite melancholic, and yet it is an enormous success for you as an author. How do you feel about that weird juxtaposition between the joy of first-time writing success and the fact that the story itself is actually deeply, deeply sad and in many ways quite melancholic?
Well, I think first of all, as a reader, before even as a writer, I love books that move me or that make me feel something, and anything that can make me be immersed in a story and really care for the characters as though they are my friends or my wards is what I'm looking for as a reader. But I think of Shuggie as quite sad at times, but I also think of it as very funny and tender and violent and all different kinds of emotions. Because for me, rather than melancholic, it's a book that I hope is just brimming with humanity and really celebrates this family in 1980s Glasgow and looks at everything they are going through at the time.
It certainly does that. When I say the book is melancholic, I'm cutting to a core emotion in the book. But of course, anyone who reads this book, it's a book that's going to be studied, dissected. People will write about it in literary, theoretic terms. You can't reduce it to melancholy. There are many emotions. There's a maelstrom of emotion that you will go through as a reader, and no doubt which you went through as a writer as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later if we have enough time to get into the details of the writing process. For those who haven't read the book, give them a basic précis of the Glaswegian family that this book centers around, and the two main characters in particular.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Shuggie Bain for me is actually a love story. It is the love story between a mother and her youngest son, Shuggie. And it's the type of love that only children can have, the often tested, unconditional love that children can have for flawed parents. It is a portrait of the Bain family who are living in 1980s Glasgow while the remote Thatcher government down in Westminster in London is dismantling all heavy industry. The family are struggling to survive, but the mother of the family is this beautiful, intelligent, driven, proud mother called Agnes Bain, but she has married the wrong man. And after her husband brutally abandons her and her 3 children in a North Lanarkshire coal mining town, which is being dismantled under the Thatcher government, Agnes begins to spiral into addiction. It is her 3 children who stay by their mother's side the longest and try to save their mother from herself and from her troubles. But it's her youngest son, Shuggie, that really clings to his mother. But Shuggie is going through his own sense of isolation because he is a very young boy who is very quickly othered by the community around him. This is a very patriarchal community. It's a very hard-working, hard-loving, hard-drinking. Those are the type of men that run this community. And Shuggie instantly, at about 6 years old, is seen as being no right, they call him, which what they mean by that is he is precocious and effeminate and just not how boys should be. It's about how his masculinity doesn't conform.
I am absolutely intrigued that you had anticipated actually where I was going to go next. I wanted to ask you a simple question, which will elicit a complicated little bit of a dialogue between us about love. And
Mm.
you've described this epic as a love story. And
Mm.
I'm going to tell you the question, but I don't actually want you to answer it because we'll come back to it after the question I will put in between. I was going to ask you, do you think that Agnes, his mom, loves Shuggie? And we'll come to love because I think it's a big and a beautiful and complex theme throughout this novel. But I actually want to talk about addiction because addiction really, really fascinates me. I have, like many of us, witnessed addiction in our families. This is a story of addiction that knows no color, it doesn't know any class or geography. And part of the universality of the story is that Agnes's attempt to maintain her dignity while at the same time being an addict is a wrestle that's really, really one of the more beautiful tension points throughout. She's almost like a working class Sue Ellen from Dallas. And yet at the same time, she is dealing with this disease called alcoholism.
Mm.
And it made me think about my mom's toxic relationship with alcohol. And
Mm.
it will be one of the facts in the book about Agnes that so many people will recognize. So many of my friends who are authors or just voracious readers were telling me they struggle to finish the book, not because it's not a masterpiece, but because it was just too true for them. And so much of what plays out in the book was way too triggering and recognizable. Can you reflect for me a little bit, Douglas, on alcoholism specifically and addiction more generally, and what it is about those realities that we often don't speak about, let alone put inside a work of fiction as trenchantly as you have, that made you go there?
Yeah, I think what readers would probably need to know about me first is I am the son of a single mother who suffered with alcoholism her entire life. My earliest memories were centered around addiction, and then my mother passed away from her addiction when I was about 16. And so in writing the book, I came to it with this enormous sense of grief or loss. I've lost the person that I love most in the world, and I wanted to put that on the page. There is a tradition in working class fiction, certainly in West of Scottish fiction, where the alcoholic or the poor struggling soul is put in literature, but it's usually a man. And if you think about Irvine Welsh, you think about Alistair Gray, you think about James Kelman. And when it's a man, we forgive him and we almost cheer him on because the nihilism in it and the sort of the destruction in it can be quite thrilling to watch. I knew from personal experience when it is a woman and when it is a mother who is suffering from addiction, that how society treats it is really damning, and it just creates this sense of shame and stigma and isolation that first of all hurts the addict themselves, but then also really hurts the family around them. And I wanted to rewrite history in this man's world, in this post-industrial landscape, and really frame it through the lens of a single mother and a queer son, but really through Agnes's eyes, and just to show how isolated she was in that way. But you're right when you say that she is a very powerful woman, and she has an enormous amount of pride and strength and determination,
Mm.
and she has a really deep sense of her own self-worth. And so as she descends into alcoholism, her sense of self-worth actually starts to heighten, and
Yes.
she presents herself more beautifully and flawlessly to the world. And this also starts to backfire upon her because sometimes in communities, when we see people with an inflated sense of self-worth and we know that there's a problem behind it or they shouldn't feel that
That's
way,
right. Yeah.
and the community wants to tear them down. And so Agnes really goes through this, and her isolation is actually added to by how other women perceive it. It's not always men, it's how women start to react to her.
Yeah. That is absolutely true. There was a scene that was chilling for me later in the story. And I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but on the journey of Agnes, another man out of the many men that enter her life is Eugene, who is another taxi driver. And Eugene falls for this beautiful woman and takes her out to quite a posh place to go and wine and dine. And she has been doing quite well. She had her first soberversary already. He attended it, and he just can't make sense of why a bunch of folks have this strange relationship with alcohol, because he clearly doesn't. And he pushes and prods when they are out having a meal at this place. And a little bit of the conversation, he asks her to have a glass of wine. And I'll just read a little bit from that scene. And Agnes obviously puts up a fuss and says she doesn't want any. And it then goes as follows. But why? Agnes was suddenly very tired because it's what normal people do. He moved the warm glass. Look, just a sip, to be social-like. You'll be fine. Listen, if you start any trouble, I'll have them put you out and you can walk home. He pushed the glass towards her by its long, elegant stem. You'll be fine. You're a different woman now. I didn't judge Eugene in that moment, Douglas, because people who are not inside the battle of addiction or who aren't children of addicts or almost addicts, like you have been, I've been, many readers would have been, don't quite understand that for some of us, we binge drink, but we're not alcoholics. Some of us are occasional drinkers. Some of us are heavy drinkers, but not addicts. And there's quite a gradation there. And unless you've had the misfortune to be in a family where you've had to learn literacy on addiction, it's really difficult to comprehend as a bystander who's unaware of addiction and what it does psychologically to those for whom it's either I get completely drunk or I must stay dry, to understand why they can't moderate. How do you feel as a reader? I don't know if it's possible to bifurcate yourself between being author and reader, but as a reader, how do you feel about Eugene in that moment? Because there's nothing worse than someone trying to persuade a third party or someone else saying, just have one sip, that addiction is for life and that you can have the smallest of trigger that can set you back again.
Yeah, I try not to judge Eugene. Eugene comes into the story and the readers will see him as, he almost comes in like a knight on a black taxi cab. There's a theme in the book of the men are racing around the city in these black hackney cabs, we call them in Glasgow. And her first husband is terrible to her and does this. And then Eugene almost comes in as a bright light. And we think he's going to be her hero on a shining steed. And I won't spoil it for the reader. But a lot of what the book deals with is the notion of what it means to be normal or what it means to conform, both from Shuggie's point of view, but also from Agnes's. People want her, you look normal, you look normal. Why can't you behave yourself? Even her own mother at the beginning of the book sees it as a failure of her will. And of course, in hard drinking societies like Glasgow, like Scotland, it's really difficult for an alcoholic to tell the break point between a good time and a bad time. Even when I was doing research for the book, and I would ask people when they felt they tipped over into their own addiction, sometimes they couldn't pinpoint it very clearly. It wasn't like it was one Wednesday and it happened. It could be a very slow, gradual movement towards it. And years can go by and then suddenly you realize, oh, I've been here for a long time. And so Eugene sees all of these characters who are really suffering with addiction and who he sees them as very rotted, withered people. And then he turns and he pans to Agnes and he sees Agnes as she's a very glamorous woman. She's glorious against the landscape. And he says, but you're not like that. I don't see you being like that. And so you can handle it. You're fine. You're normal. And that becomes her downfall. But Eugene just doesn't understand addiction. And I think he truly wants to love her and he wants to be with her, but he can't handle the shame, the stigma of alcoholism. He can handle her drinking and drinking quite heavily, I think, but he can't handle the stigma of her identifying as an alcoholic.
The last question on that, one theme that surfaces towards within the second half of this epic novel is suicidality, which I've been dying, pardon the pun, to write on myself for many years in a broader work that I have been promising my own readers for way too many years, dealing with death and illness and meaning of life. And one of the things about suicidality and suicide in particular that fascinates me are social attitudes towards suicidality.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of the first major scenes, without giving it away, where Agnes deals with suicidality, she responds to Leek, who's
Mm-hmm.
trying to basically save her from herself by
Mm-hmm.
suggesting that he's not acting in a loving manner.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for me, that's very profound, and I've no doubt that you know exactly why you put those words in her mouth. Talk
Mm-hmm.
to me about, philosophically or otherwise, your attitude towards suicidality and that theme in the novel, because so many people colloquially think of
Mm-hmm.
suicide and suicidality as profoundly selfish. And as
Mm-hmm.
with addiction, there are a lot of myths, hasty judgments, and moralizing, as
Right.
opposed to trying to understand from the inside, even though it's impossible, what might be moving the person.
Mm-hmm. I tried to approach the book and the writing of it with two things, with as much empathy as I could, and to understand my mother's position, and to be clear, it wasn't just my family that was struggling in the 80s Glasgow. Unemployment was 26%, and it stayed there for a generation. There was families all around us that were going through very similar things. But I tried to approach the writing of addiction with as much empathy as I could, but without judgment. I didn't want to. I wanted to show it without commenting on it, and to show all of its shades, because I felt that was uh, it's such a thorny, complicated issue that I couldn't take a definitive point of view on it. And actually, part of why I loved writing a chorus of characters in the book was because I wanted to show it as quite a panoramic problem, or all of the issues are quite complex. But Agnes is a woman who, by the society around her, by how she was, what she was told to expect, is going to reach her dreams or her potential. And for a lot of the book, she's seen as being too much. And actually, she's not too much. It's the world around her that's not enough. And it's not going to get better for Agnes. You know, I think she can see this quite early on, and she's not going to have the glamour or even the very simple things that she wants. A home with a front door of her own. She wants clothes for her children that she doesn't have to buy and put away on layaway or credit. And so that accelerates her drinking, and her alcoholism is a form of escapism. It's a form of coping. It's a form of just numbing the things that she might be feeling. And her, throughout the book, a big theme, not just to talk about suicide, but is about people leaving, about people abandoning, or the point they have to reach where they decide they have to save themselves because they can't save Agnes. And this is a thing that all of our children have to confront. But Agnes also confronts it as well. And part of her, what she does in that scene in the book is her trying to, like, she can't cope anymore. She can't deal with herself. And it's not a selfish thing, and it's not a cry for help. It's she's trying to withdraw from her children and stop being a burden on them. And actually, you see it echoed again at the end of the book when she starts to reject Shuggie. And Shuggie doesn't know why he's being rejected, because surely Shuggie's been the most loyal, loving child all the way through this book. He's been really a font of love for his mother. But Agnes starts to push him away because she realizes he won't save himself.
I struggle to not read the book simultaneously with two frameworks that just reflect my own intellectual upbringing and my own personality. On the one hand, deep empathy, which you achieve as an author by allowing us to understand the internal logic of the characters' behaviors and attitudes and characters. And I think you achieve that beautifully. And then there's a part of me that has done way too much normative philosophy that
Mhm.
wants to ask questions about the moral appropriateness of the behavior of the characters and their relationships with other persons. And in that spirit, I want to ask you, despite your first answer in this interview,
Mhm.
do you think Agnes loves Shuggie and her children?
Yes, I think she does. I think we often and certainly children of addicts, think that when a parent is flawed and suffering with addiction, that the fault lies within us. That if we can be quieter, smarter, funnier, brighter, do better at school, whatever the solution is, that somehow we can alter that parent's addiction. We also think oftentimes that when a parent has addiction, it stems from them not loving us enough. If you loved me, you would get better. If you loved me, you would stop doing that thing you're
Yes.
doing. And actually, that is, I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think the war and the battle always rages only inside the addict. And I think the character of Agnes's love is maybe not enough for herself or enough hope for tomorrow. But I don't think it's about how she loves her children. I think she loves her children profoundly, as any mother does. But I think she is dealing with things that she can't get beyond herself for. And the destruction that she's bringing about herself is for herself. And in a way, that's the conflict that rages between the two brothers, between Leek and between Shuggie.
Yeah.
Because Leek has already reached the point by the end of the book where he understands his mother is not going to get better and she's going to accelerate into her troubles. And Shuggie won't believe it because Shuggie believes that Agnes will get better and things will get better if only he loves her harder, if only he gives her more. He keeps saying this. And Leek just understands that's not what it is, that no matter how Shuggie approaches Agnes, he can't alter her because it's all within their mother.
Yeah, you see, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, nothing that you say I disagree with. I think you're beautifully deconstructing your own work in that description of how she's consumed by not even being enough for herself in some respects, but in other respects, the world is not enough for her. And then, of course, addiction itself is a disease. But what I meant by a normative ideal of love is that if I had to think in theoretical terms about the gold standard of love, like the gold standard of friendship, I would say things like not being too self-obsessed, not being too self-regarding, but having regard also in a truly deep, genuine way for the interest of the other person with whom you stand in a certain relationship with. If Douglas is my friend, truly, then there are certain things I'm expected to do normatively that is evidence of deep care for his well-being, his goals, the things that provide meaning to him. And my life can't be completely I, and egocentric. And in that sense, I wonder whether in her relations with her children, there's a sufficiently deep regard for their well-being.
I think in a person who's not suffering with really dark mental health issues, that is absolutely true. But I think, first of all, Agnes is suffering profoundly herself. And so I don't think she can cast, and she does it at times throughout the book. I mean, she helps Shuggie to accept himself. She tells him how to reject shame. She sees him very deeply. But I think there's such a weather system that's spinning inside her at all times that she can't almost get beyond that to consider her children enough or to return that love for them. So I suppose in a way you're right that in a normal relationship you should be able to project and think about the other person, and Agnes can't do that, or she can't do it consistently.
Douglas, we only have 5 minutes left. We'd be remiss not to at least signal one or two other themes that come up. Can you read for us? And while you find a page to read from that we agreed on, if you still have it, one of the themes, as you are watching this interview with Douglas Stuart, the author of Shuggie Bain, one of the themes that emerge in this book as well is the embodiment of effeminate persons. It's not even only about sexual orientation. Who knows whether the young Shuggie may end up being gay, bisexual, bi-curious, gender non-conforming, whatever the case might be. And that too is something that, for me, was beautifully presented in the novel, Douglas. And I've gone through that myself. I now look, by societal stereotypes, quite masculine and have big physicality because of my body. But as a child in primary school, I used to be teased verbally all the time for being extremely effeminate and not looking like the other boys and just avoiding them, on the school playground, because I couldn't play rugby in this case. In his case, he's avoiding soccer as well. So queer politics is an important part of this book, and in particular, what it means to move through the world as an effeminate boy, which unfortunately still remains a massive, massive, horrible phenomenological experience for way too many queer kids around the globe. Read for us a little bit, Douglas, just in the 2 or 3 minutes we have left.
Absolutely. So Shuggie has actually come across another boy, and the other boy has very quickly discerned that something isn't right about Shuggie. The boy was watching him, peering through half-lidded eyes the same way Shuggie had seen the miner's children squint when he raised his hand in class. It was a blend of disbelief and disdain. He had often seen his granny look at his father that way. Shuggie turned his left kneecap inwards. Then Johnny smiled. His face changed so quickly it made Shuggie take a step back. It was like the flick of a light switch, and his face brightened like a bare bulb in an empty room. "Is that a dolly you've got, Shuggie?" The boy was using his name like he had known him a long while. Without waiting for an answer, he added, "Are you a wee girl?" He stepped into the long grass, flattening it as he came. Shuggie shook his head again. "If you're no wee girl, then you must be a wee poof." He tightened his smile. His voice was low and sweet, like he was talking to a puppy. "You're no a wee poof, are you?" Shuggie didn't know what a poof was, but he knew it was bad. Catherine called Leak it when she wanted to hurt his feelings. "Do you know what a poof there is, wee man? A poof is a boy who does dirty things with other boys." Johnny was up against Shuggie now, nearly double his height. "A poof is a boy who wants to be a wee girl."
Thank you for that. Thank you for reading that.
Thank you.
A second last question. I'll give you a minute each for the last two questions. I really wish we had more time, but we should share you with the rest of the broadcasting world and other book journalists. Second last question then. In terms of the writing process, which is a whole conversation on its own, so give me a high-level description. Was it difficult to write this book, given how close to home it is for you? You come across to me as having effect in the way in which you speak about your work, but neither emotional nor extremely analytical. But I can imagine many of us trying to write a work this deeply personal and finding it too bloody hard to continue after every few moments of writing. But you have wonderful authorial control in this conversation.
Yeah, it was difficult. I mean, I think when you're the child of trauma and loss, then it's hard to confront that. And writing the book made me confront it all the time. But choosing to write a work of fiction also gave me control when I didn't have control in my younger life. And so there was an incredibly cathartic thing that comes by examining these things and then laying them on the page. But also as a child, you don't necessarily understand the environment you're in or why people do that. Why is there racism, misogyny, homophobia, sectarianism? Why are all these things happening? And as an adult, as a writer, you are forced to confront those things. And when you confront difficult things, there's a healing that comes with it.
And lastly, the worst thing that one wants to therefore avoid is, especially when you come from a working class background or lack of privilege, is producing a work that is anthropological gaze upon the working class. You managed to sidestep that danger. How did you do so?
I tried to create the work as immersive as I could for the reader, and I wanted to make the reader sit in the room with the characters. You're right in the fact that you can create what is called a poverty safari, where people get to come in and gawp at some hard times and then go back to worrying about whatever it is we worry about, oat milk, politics. And so what I wanted to really do was to force the reader to sit in the room with the characters. And force is a bad word, but to invite them and then to build the world entirely around them. And I think if you show people with all of their flaws and their richness and you paint the world with as much detail as you can muster, then it creates an almost inclusive experience for the reader. And that's what I wanted to do. It's also important never to judge the characters, even if they do something bad.
Yes.
You have to allow them to do that. And also not to place a filter of 2021 on things we know better about, but because you have to write for the truth of the characters and not for the feelings of the reader.
That's right. And capturing that 1980s setting without the sort of moralism of 2020 hindsight, or 2021 hindsight, as it were. Douglas Stuart, absolutely brilliant first novel, Douglas Stuart's Shuggie Bain. You must all go out and find a copy at Exclusive Books, read it, discuss it, come back to it, and get a box of tissues while you are out at the store buying this book. Thank you so much for joining us on Cover to Cover, Douglas.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Once more, thank you so much to Douglas Stuart, who is an incredibly busy author now that he has won this major award, for having made time for you and me to be in conversation with him. Just a couple of final things from my side. Firstly, those of you who are now desperate to read this book, I don't know about you, I'm still romantic about physical copies. I still prefer them to digital. If you are like me, then you want to go to your nearest exclusive bookstore and find a copy of this book. It is available nationwide at any of the stores. Please go and have a look there. Alternatively, please check out the website, exclusivebooks.co.za. And for future reference, make sure that you also become a subscriber to the Exclusive Books YouTube channel. Then you will never again miss any of the cover-to-cover interviews that we bring you. If you can't wait for the next author interviews, then follow myself on Twitter @Eusebius. And you can also make sure that you check out my Facebook page and the page of Joanne Joseph and subscribe to one of those two pages, as well as the Exclusive Books one on Facebook, and then you will be able to see when the next interviews and book reviews will happen. In fact, roughly about 2 weeks from now, you can look forward to, with Joanne, the next episode of Cover to Cover. Until then, happy reading.